Hello, and welcome to Moving the Needle on Wicked Problems, our podcast. Today, we continue our mini series on racism and diversity in Canada, and we are going to take a deep dive into how racism affects our lives and look at our lives through the lens of diversity. For this episode, we are going to look at journalism in Canada because we all know how important journalism is to the way we get our news and form our opinions. So is journalism really diverse or diverse enough? Do organizations do enough to recruit and promote BIPOC journalists? And what's the impact of diversity, or conversely, what's the impact of lack of diversity on the stories and issues that are covered by the media?
Absolutely, Senator. I think this will be a very interesting episode to sort of deep dive into the journalist world and see where there is a lacking of diversity or where there's, areas of light. But I also wanted to add to this is that, there recently has been an escalation of racist comments and threats against BIPOC journalists. Media organizations such as the CBC and the Toronto Star have called out these vile acts. But beyond sort of supportive words, it's really unclear what is being done to protect these journalists. What should organizations do to deal with racism and threats against their people? So there's a lot of questions that need a lot of answers, I guess. So we have a lot to talk about, so let's get to the interview.
So to look into this whole issue of diversity, racism in journalism, I'm really privileged. Paul and I are really privileged to talk today to Supriya Dwivedi. Supriya is senior counsel at Enterprise Canada, political commentator, and former radio host. And we are also joined by Nicholas Keung from the Toronto Star. Nicholas writes about immigration, refugee, and diversity issues, and his work has enlightened many people and has won many awards. Both are seasoned professionals that can help us understand this particular conversation about journalism and its interplay with diversity and racism. So with that, welcome Supriya and Nicholas. One of your colleagues, journalist Denise Balkasoon, has said that equity is still a big issue in Canadian journalism. Is she right?
Yes, unequivocally yes. I mean, I will state just for the record and for full disclosure, Denise is a good friend of mine, so her and I have talked about this quite a bit. But if you just look at the stats in terms of who is working for, major legacy organizations, and then who in those roles are given positions of power, like who are given senior roles, and how much power, once they're actually there, are they really given? Are they simply there to fill a diversity sort of checkbox in terms of a masthead, or by saying, we have one racialized radio host in terms of our roster? Or are they actually given, decision-making power on the back end and invited to, the real table of sorts as to, where decisions are made?
So go ahead, Nicholas.
Yeah, I can't agree with Supriya anymore. And I think it's been an issue that visible minority journalists have been aware of and talked about among ourselves. But I think for a long time, it wasn't really discussed publicly. And there's been this sense of, at least for my generation, and I think I started my career, before, earlier than Supriya and even Denise. I started my career in the 90s. And I felt like, when I joined, the Star, I felt like, I was put into that place in a quote unquote mainstream organization. And I think the expectation was different. There was a time when, the journalism was dying. I think, a lot of, people who started in my generation had different expectations. We were just grateful being there. And I think nowadays, as we all know, all those dinosaur media organizations actually are fading and, not doing well in terms of advertising. And I think the newer generation of reporters, visible minority reporters, in the newer generations, they already started a career on contracts, from contract to contract, and I think their expectation is a bit different, and there's no need to be safe. They could be bold and more ambitious, seeking for change. And I think that's why it's more talked about, as a topic now, and more openly than when I started as a Visman, reporter, in the mainstream media.
So let me ask maybe the question many people will ask. Journalists are truth tellers, and the truth does not have race attached to it. So why does this matter at all? After all, the news is the news.
You're right. The news is the news and the truth is the truth. I am a firm believer in that. But in terms of what stories and what news gets covered, it absolutely matters in terms of who is deciding editorially, where to send a reporter and how to cover it, the angle in which you're covering it, right? I think in the last few years, we've really seen a groundswell sort of switch in terms of reporting on crime and policing in general, where, a few years ago, and particularly, if we're talking decades ago, you would take whatever statement the police were giving to you at complete face value and basically print it verbatim. Now you're starting to get increasing pushback because of the work of racialized folks on the ground who are saying, hey, wait a second, that's not always true. And with the advent of everyone having these, pocket computers, aka our phones, that have recording devices on them, we are now seeing in unfortunate graphic reality how sometimes the truth, and I'm putting that in air quotes, what the police put forward isn't necessarily what you're actually seeing and actually experiencing.
So with this diversity comes a different perspective and a different way of covering the news. Nick, you've been a reporter with the Star for as long as I've been reading the Star, which is a long time.
I started as a toddler, so just
as a toddler, yes. So I'm going to ask you a question about your beat. You cover immigration stories, and I love reading them, and you're a brilliant investigative journalist. But why have you been assigned immigration? Was that your choice? Would you have, let's say, preferred to do international trade, or because you are an immigrant, you've been assigned the immigration beat? Is there some kind of reverse racism built into this as well?
That's a very interesting question. Before I became the immigration reporter, I was actually offered at one point to be the Chinese issue reporter on staff. I took it as a compliment because obviously I think there are not many reporters in the quote unquote mainstream media, whatever that means today, who can actually read, write, and understand and speak Chinese, both Cantonese and Mandarin. So definitely I take it as an advantage for me to explore some of those stories. But at the same time, I certainly didn't want to be pigeonholed to be a one-dimensional reporter. And I just feel a lot of times, being a Visman reporter, you in the media, you have to prove yourself that you can deliver all the other kind of stories like any other Canadian colleagues can. And on top of that, you have more to offer. I always feel that kind of obligation and that burden on my shoulders to do that. But so I counter offered, why don't, instead of like trying to cover these stories in silos, why don't we bring these communities together? What are some of the more, issues that can bring all these communities together would be, through immigration, because we all come as immigrants, one way or the other. So that's sort of what happened. So when I took up the job as the immigration reporter back in 2003, it was my choice. Yeah, but as as a compromise. Yeah.
So Supriya, you've also had an interesting career. Let me put it this way. How hard has it been for you to climb the ladder? And you're relatively young. You have a long way to go, and I'm sure you'll be super successful. But what has your experience been so far?
In terms of climbing the actual ladder, I would say that I am very grateful to, the work of all of the journalists like, Nicholas, who've come before me, who have really laid the groundwork and who have made it so much easier for my generation and, folks younger than me that are now coming up the ladder. One thing that I will say in terms of where I found it difficult, being often the only racialized person in the room of a senior leadership team or of senior media folks, is that often what the issues that you're talking about, whether it's racism, whether it's online vitriol or hate, you're not necessarily believed. And it's not as though people are like pointing at you and saying that you're lying or that you're making stuff up, but it's just, it's downplayed. So I was very public in what happened to me when I was a talk radio host here in the city of Toronto. And there was a certain level, I think, of incredulity that a lot of my predominantly male white colleagues would come back at me with when I would, read them what I was getting. And it's not as though they weren't sympathetic, they were. It's just that to them, it's often like, oh, well, I get mean tweets too. And it's like, yeah, I'm not talking about mean tweets. I'm talking about very graphic threats of rape and death towards me, right? So it's a different ball game, and I would say that's probably one of the biggest sort of disconnects that I would have experienced, because in terms of actual ladder climbing, as it were, I was pretty lucky. I mean, I was given a very prominent role, like talk radio. Either you're the morning show host or you're the afternoon drive host, right? Those are the two big slots. So I've been very fortunate in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've both sort of mentioned that, obviously that diversity is a problem in journalism. And Supriya, you were just talking about your experience as the talk radio host. I'm wondering, what can organizations do, not only just the media companies themselves, like the Toronto Star or Global, whoever, but also the sort of umbrella organizations like the Canadian Association of Journalists, do to either, one, protect journalists, the BIPOC journalists that are facing, online threats or even just threats to their house coming through the mail or whatever it is, but also to encourage more diversity within their ranks and promote people, have them in positions of power rather than just maybe, as you said, sort of filling a box.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'll jump in here, and then I promise I'll let you I'll let you get in there. I mean, there's actually quite a bit. So, I mean, in terms of what media organizations can actually do, I have mentioned this in the past, but Defector Media, it's an American outlet, it's a startup outlet, and they actually provide a whole host of protections for their folks that are reporting on the ground. They provide paid time off if you need to take a break from what you're doing. They provide a proxy in terms of if you're getting just a torrent of hate on your social media accounts and you need somebody else to be, assessing whether something is just a nasty, racist, diatribe against you, or if there's an actual legitimate threat in there. Defector will also work with authorities. They'll get you legal help, mental health supports, that sort of thing. And then lastly, I would just say, if you're talking about actual journalism organizations, I think one of the things that they should be pushing, aside from everything I've just listed, is better protections for freelancers. Because as Nick pointed out at the onset of this conversation, journalism is dying. And a lot of folks that do this work, they do it because they love it and they're moving from contract to contract. They don't necessarily have the same sort of labor protections that, unionized employees or otherwise full-time employees at one of these legacy media corps will have.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I certainly feel like obviously there's a generational gaps, I think, in a good way. I think that's part of the diversity of perspectives here that, Supriya and I offered. And I feel like always still like talking and thinking about diversity and inclusion at the organizational level I still feel is a luxury. We all know that news organizations have struggled for a long time to get, advertising and subscribers in the internet age. And when these organizations trying to meet the bottom line for profits, I don't think, diversity and inclusion necessarily are their top priorities. And but I feel certainly, at the organization levels, certainly, the support, whatever support they could offer to BIPOC reporters even in terms of, some sort of programs, mentorship program to promote them to the positions in power, I think would be super helpful. So they can, at the editorial meetings, they could offer different perspectives, and even like, what the colonial lens, telling stories through the colonial lens, we can have more first-person voices. And I think that process itself is empowering to both the BIPOC reporters and for those communities they represent. And I think at the government level, certainly, the Liberal government has been talking about, these online bullying and hate crime legislations. And I just hope that, they would put more teeth to it, to criminalize those kind of, behaviors, including hate, against journalists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So thank you, Nick, for mentioning the legislative lever. Yes, we all know that the hate crime legislation that was proposed in the last parliament will likely find its expression in the next parliament. But part of, legislation often drives ideas underground. They may not be in the public sphere, but they've been driven underground. Do you worry about these? There are all kinds of social media platforms. Do you worry about hate just moving to another place away from, formal journalism to informal expressions of ideas? I guess that's always there, but I just wanted to get your view on legislation as a lever, but a limited lever against the way people think and react.
I think that's interesting, because I think the internet age actually brought, a lot of those hate folks, to the open, above ground. But does it make me feel safer when I do my job, when I write about these stories? Like, I don't know, but my concern is more about, by having these, comments and hateful thoughts, in public, is going to normalize, that is being accepted, is okay, and it's going to further promote those kind of thinking. Like, I think, if you ask me, my thoughts, whether, it's actually, would that drive, these people more further underground? And I think, we need to, balance, strike that balance, between promoting these ideas versus pushing them underground. I would rather not seeing them open to make it normal to, to have these kind of thinkings. And even like, the last two federal elections, for example, I think, we've heard a lot of criticisms and debates about, whether we should even legitimize the People's Party, led by Mr. Bernier. Like, I think that's, I think it's important for us to have those kind of discussions, but, somehow we just need to, while doing that, not to promote those ideas. So I think it's a really tough call. Yeah.
Okay. So Supriya, I want to reflect on the election that we just had. Unlike, let's say, Germany, which also had an election, issues of immigration did not really make it into the debates or the discourse. And maybe that's a good thing. In fact, most people think it's one of the good features of our system that we don't talk about, issues like racism and mixed up with immigration during election debates. But we all know that there's a rise of there's a rise of Islamophobia. There's also a particular rise of hate against Chinese Canadians because of our relationship with China. Do you believe that journalists should talk about this and insert this into the debates? I mean, outside the question by Sachi Curl on Bill 21 in Quebec, it barely got any airtime.
Yeah, it did barely get any airtime. And I think you look at who were on the campaign buses and, look at what the Ottawa Press Gallery looks like, and you get a pretty clear picture as to why issues of, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, the spike against, Asian Canadians in terms of actual acts of violence as well as words of hate have all increased, and and it becomes very clear as to why that's left off of the agenda. What's interesting to me is that journalists don't necessarily have a ton of issue with inserting themselves into the narrative when they see fit, and yet when it comes to issues of racism, diversity, etc., they tend to play the we're just objective observers and all of this. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have a good answer beyond the reason why it was left off is because, again, there was not a lot of diversity in terms of who was covering the election.
So one way of looking at this is if we had more people with your lens, yours and Nick's lens, both in the newsrooms, on the airwaves, behind the radio waves, and in the editorial rooms. I think that is important, the editorial rooms, the narrative will shift. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And let me give you a tangible example. So when we were talking about the Afghan crisis and what was happening, at the time the election was called, right? The narrative around the refugees that Canada was going to be welcoming were solely relegated to fixers that were in Afghanistan for Canadian journalists or translators. We weren't talking about actual increases in terms of our, targets for accepting refugees. And as you noted, it was largely left off the, overall discourse of the election. That to me was a major, failure of journalism in this country, to not have looked at the broader picture and not have looked at, what Canada can do to increase our numbers in terms of welcoming Afghan refugees, and how we can partner with some of our, allies in the region who may not, have our record when it comes to being as open and welcoming to refugees. To work with them to say, okay, you probably can better get them out. You're probably better suited to actually physically get them out. And then once they're out, we'll take them and we'll make them our own here in Canada.
And I just wanted to add to a comment that Supriya actually mentioned about, the diversity, in the Parliament Hill, for example. When I look around, I find it interesting. If you look at, because usually I think political writers, they're more prestiged, at least in the print media, whether City Hall, Queen's Park, or Parliament Hill. I don't know, when it comes to the career paths of the BIPOC journalists, whether, there's there's a lack of their representation in those bureaus, they don't think of themselves, working in covering politics, for example. If you look around, really, it's primarily white journalists, covering politics, and we all know that politicians, they are decision makers, they are the authorities, powers, and I don't know, when it comes to grooming, BIPOC reporters, maybe it's an opportunity. There are opportunities out there for media outlets to actually mentor the BIPOC, to explore, BIPOC journalists, to explore that as a career options for them, instead of being sort of I wouldn't say, I was pigeonholed to cover immigration, because I really enjoy telling these stories, but at the same time, I've never thought of, covering politics as an option for me, in my career, and it wasn't my choice. I just thought it wasn't there for me.
Supriya, you talked about mean tweets, and I'm going to go there for a bit, because I too, like both of you, get mean tweets, likely not as many as you do. But over time, I have developed a thicker skin. Have you? And is that part of the armor that you have to put on?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think I have. I think I've developed I refer to it as a bit of a calloused skin, because I think that's how you have to look at it. And I think there's, for me, the line that was crossed was when, the threats weren't just relegated to myself, or weren't even just relegated to my husband, but they brought my then, 1-year-old daughter into it. And that was when that was my line. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I was like, all right, I'm out. Like, it's one thing if I have to worry about myself, and, I'm pretty careful about my online presence. Like, I never will take a picture of myself where it's visible what neighborhood I'm living in or whatever. But I didn't want to have to really think about every single time I'm posting something and my daughter's there. Can you see a street sign? Can you see a park sign of where she is? Is there going to be, some nutter out there who has it out for me, who's going to figure out where she's going to preschool, And so these were the things that were going through my mind, and for me, it just wasn't worth it. So I tapped out.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, I have developed this technique to compartmentalize my lives. Just don't let my work life interfere, insulate myself from those kind of personal attacks or criticisms. And I think as journalists, we've all had pretty thick skin to be able to do our job anyway. But I think, we just, have developed those kind of skills. And I think we all have to have like pretty good EQ in order to, protect ourselves mentally.
And do you think, like, with all of this going on about, a lack of diversity in journalism, we often see almost every day Twitter fights between journalists and other people, journalists calling, or columnists, I guess, whatever you want to call them, calling others psychos and this and that. Do we have a situation where trust is being broken between the general public and journalists? Not only, and what I'm getting by that is if it's not very diverse and people aren't seeing the stories that they should be seeing because there is this lack of diversity, what trust do individual citizens have in journalists now, and how can we mend that trust if there is a lack of trust there? I don't know, Supriya, if you want to jump in there.
Asking us to solve journalism and yeah. I mean, look, I think it's true that there is a lack of trust, and it's further eroding. And I think we've seen that with respect to public opinion polls, and there's enough quantitative data to back that up. How you go about fixing that is a great question. And to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how you bring somebody who's already lost that trust, how you're supposed to bring it back. I think the folks that still have trust, you can likely maintain it by improving reporting and having stories reflect the communities that are, living and breathing this sort of thing. But I guess one answer to it would simply be to reflect what your actual population looks like. So if you're a paper like the Toronto Star, we know that in Toronto, for example, we're basically a majority minority city, right? And so it doesn't make sense to have a roster of these elite columnists or political writers, as Nick was referring to, solely be relegated to one gender, one race, or even one class, right? You do need a mix of voices. And I don't know if we're currently doing that with just the status quo.
And from my own observation, I do feel like, if you look at the enrollment in journalism schools, the demographics actually have been changing, and you see a lot more diversity. And if you look at any newsroom, I think there are more among the newer generation of reporters. You could see more diversity there, but I think we're still at a very early stage. And there's still definitely a lack of BIPOC journalists in the positions of power, as columnists and as managers. I think the gender equity is there in the management, but we are talking about white women primarily, not like even visible minority women. So I think having some that kind of diversity of voices, perspectives in positions of power would definitely make a big difference in terms of at least the perception, among readers or viewers, to have more trust and faith in your in your in your news and in you in the organization, right? So yeah, I think we need to work towards that, having more people of color in those positions.
I'm curious, sorry, if you don't mind, just jump in there, Senator, just quickly for just to follow up on that. I'm just wondering, we've been essentially a year and a half from George Floyd killing in the United States, which captured, people's attention. Obviously, the pandemic had something to do with that. People went onto the streets. Part of the reason why we're doing this mini series, we call it, of season 2 of the podcast, is to delve deep into where we are now. A year and a half or a year, almost 2 years later, are we seeing progress here? Is there more progress that you're seeing on a regular basis to break down these sort of barriers that BIPOC journalists are facing? And again, not only just in the sense of like ticking a number, but actually maybe moving up in the in the ranks of journalism and into different positions.
So I think the response from media companies would be that yes, there has been progress that's made and that they're listening, et cetera, et cetera. They all posted a black square on Instagram last summer and made them feel good. But in terms of actually tangible results, no, I don't think so. And I don't know if like we were to ask folks that were on the ground in those newsrooms how they feel about it, I would go ahead and venture to guess that their response would be very similar to what I'm giving you right now. And I think part of the issue is that the folks in those leadership positions, and I'm not just talking about like the columnists or the hosts or whatever, but actual management leadership positions are predominantly white, like vast majority white. And in a lot of cases, it's like, if you're not going to actually do anything about it, if you're not going to intentionally change your hiring strategy or try to put out, calls for a better diverse newsroom, then like get out the way, because there are folks coming up the ladder that are hungry, that want to enact change. And, you can't keep saying, oh, well, we're trying and we're trying and we're trying, because after a certain point, you got to show some results with the efforts that are claiming to have been put in.
So when you speak about results, and this is a very interesting thought and a question for both of you, is when we talk about results, you have to take a look at evidence. And the corporate sector has evidence by law. They have to disclose who's on their boards, who's in the senior leadership. Has anyone done evidence gathering on diversity in the media, or is now the time to do it?
I think CAJ has. I think the Canadian Association of Journalists has. I know that they sent out questionnaires and surveys to legacy and major media organizations across Canada to try and get their numbers. But this is part of the problem. You shouldn't have to have a third-party organization basically twisting arms and saying, well, we're going to publish a report and shame you essentially into your stats. This should be something that should be proactively done on behalf of media companies, precisely because if you have more diverse newsrooms, if you have people that are of different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, different religions, making these editorial decisions, you get better news. And when you get better news, more people will tune in. And to Nick, he touched on this earlier, but when you're around a media management exec table, they are thinking about bottom line and they're not thinking about diversity, but those two are married, particularly in major urban settings in Canada. So it's silly to me that is still the thought out there that's prevalent, because if you marry the two, then you will get better results, because more people will buy your product.
What I also find interesting, is related to what the comment that you just made, Supriya, is the fact that, I think the internet actually has provided a lot of opportunities for BIPOC journalists that, people like myself did not have, for my generation. What I mean is that when I started in journalism, there were, your dream is to work for the Star, to work for the Globe, and then if you look at the circulation and the readerships, I think that's because of the demographic of the community is changing, and because of the distrust in those quote unquote traditional mainstream media, that's why we are seeing people turn to other, like Thais and like other publications, Canada Land, for those kind of representation that the mainstream media doesn't provide. And I think that's, the mainstream media should take notes of that, like that, and really delve into why, they are not, getting the same number of readerships, even though the population for sure in Toronto is doubling, right? It is, when that, in the last 20 years since I started at the Star. So why, alternatively, the numbers are going down, right?
So let me ask you a question about the law again, because that's what I do. I'm a legislator, and I always, I'm curious about the legislative fix. And we've all, you talked, Nick, about the opportunity that social media platforms are opening up, but there's also a dark side to this. Social media platforms fester hate. And just as Supriya pointed out, one has to be really careful with one's personal life. And the Facebook whistleblower recently in the United States talked about hate speech, for example, which is what we have. We have legislation against hate speech. Hate speech deals with the symptoms. It doesn't deal with the cause, and the cause is the algorithms that are at play that encourage all kinds of expressions of volatility simply because they'll get more likes, and therefore Facebook will make more money or Google will make more money. Do you think in Canada, outside hate speech legislation and outside regulating social media platforms to prevent hate speech, we have to go a step further and actually look at legislating around algorithms and their use?
I think we should be demanding more transparency around how these algorithms work, particularly if you're talking about a platform, like Facebook. I will give you, again, one very small example anecdotally from my own experience. I quit Facebook very shortly after I gave birth because I got very sick of the new mommy wellness naturalist crap I was getting into my feed. I made the mistake of clicking on one group, and then before I knew it, Facebook decided that my entire feed and all of the groups that were going to be recommended to me were basically one step away from going, full Gwyneth Paltrow of like putting jade crystals and where. So I was just I was like, this sucks. Like, I'm out. Like, I still have Instagram and whatever. So I realized I'm not out of the umbrella of the behemoth that is Facebook, but it just gives you one example of how what they're feeding you. If I was somebody that was into questioning, let's say vaccines, for example, and I was just looking for more information about the differences, let's say, between a few of the vaccines that have been approved in Health Canada, it could very easily, and we've seen this, and we've heard from folks that this has happened to, start feeding you really hardcore anti-vax content. And so they're almost, the algorithm in and of itself is like a radicalization sort of machine. And that is where I think, calls for transparency and regulatory action can help, because there is something to be said about how these platforms amplify and take advantage of, simple question asking, so to say.
Mm-hmm. And I totally agree. I think before we can identify the issue, we need to know how it works first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I could carry on asking you both questions forever. But I think for now, I come to this conclusion after this conversation with both of you. The truth is diverse. And let me wish you both all the best, continue to be truth tellers through your lens. And Canada will thank you for it. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.